Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Ryan Jayne, Senior Policy Counsel here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we reflect on last week's presidential election and what we can do to prepare for President-elect Donald Trump's second term. Joining me from Minnesota is Patrick Elliott, our legal director.
Hi, happy to join you.
And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Mark Dann, our governmental affairs director. How are the vibes over there in D.C. right now, Mark?
Things in D.C. are always active, a little tense, but everyone's moving forward.
All right. So welcome, Pat. Welcome, Mark. Thank you both for joining me. There is a lot to dig into today, so we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discuss. So please leave your questions in the chat below, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show. So the first thing that I want to bring up and talk about before we get into the results of the election and what we are expecting with the incoming administration is the turnout of different demographics. We've been talking for years about how non-religious voters ought to be a significant demographic and that politicians should be paying more attention to us. And I think that message has largely gone ignored. And there's a statistic that I think is very telling when you look at the religious breakdown of how people voted. You can see, even though non-religious people are certainly not all on this exact same page, right? There's a wide variety within non-religious voters. You can see that there is a clear distinction going on here when you look on the right here. The 24%, which that is not an insignificant chunk of the electorate of non-religious voters. 71% of them voted for Harris and 26% voted for Trump. So I think this is something that hopefully we will see politicians pay a little bit more attention to. Mark, do you have any other insights on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially when you said 21% of the electorate. That seems to be creeping up just a little bit every single election. So that's really important, that our goal is to make sure nuns have a very large share and large voice at the table, and understand that our community is a growing voice in the electorate, and that other groups might be a little less so. So I think that's a pretty important takeaway. I know that's been one of our overall objectives here at FFRF, and hopefully that number will keep continuing as a percentage of the electorate for years to come.
Absolutely. And so one other thing I wanted to mention is that I've seen a lot of coverage of the results of this election in terms of because Donald Trump got the majority of votes, that people are saying this gives him a clear mandate, or this is the conclusion of the American populace, that as if like the majority of Americans showed up in strong support of Donald Trump. That's how it's being framed. And I want to just remind people, a little reality check, that unfortunately in this reality, the plurality of our eligible voters are those who did not vote, right? So it's about 35% of American eligible voters don't show up to vote, and then about 33% went for Trump and about 32% went for Harris, just round numbers. So it's misleading, I think, the way that this is often reported in terms of the voters who showed up, and so it makes it seem like 51% of American eligible voters went for Trump, when it's just important to remember that that's not the case. It's more like a third of the country, not half of the country. Okay, with that said, Mark, could you speak a little bit to what the election brought us in terms of the makeup of Congress and what we can expect the House and the Senate to look like next session?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is, however you score it, this was a Trump victory. Whether it would say GOP victory or not, that remains to be seen. So 53, it looks like, we'll see what happens in Pennsylvania, but it looks like 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats in the Senate. Obviously, the two wild cards are going to be Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. who are going to be who are thought of as more moderate members of the chamber. Susan Collins is going to potentially be the chair of the Appropriations Committee. So that might start coloring things a little bit. And keep in mind, after Trump had an electoral college victory in 2016, it was 52 Republicans in the Senate, 48 Democrats. Turning to the House, very close margins in the House. If you want to put money, it looks like going into today, there are some outlets that are calling the House for the Republicans, but this is going to be a very, very small governing majority. So on the max side, it could be 225. On this, there might be a slimmer chance that the Democrats could take the chamber, although that's not likely. So that means let's assume that Speaker Johnson, has 7 votes to play with. Well, we've seen it is a very fractious caucus that is happening on the Republican side with far-right members. You've got some very vulnerable incumbents that are very vulnerable Republicans that are coming in. There's roughly 20 races where fewer than 10,000 votes made the difference. So on average, about 400,000 votes per House district usually is where things are nationally, just give or take a little bit. And so that would be a difference of less than 2.5% in a lot of elections. So he has to balance the needs of his far-right folks, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz and the type, and against a lot of his new frontline members who might not be down to go full Project 2025, but we'll see where they are on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point at the end. It seems like Trump and Mike Johnson are going to have to choose between are they going to fulfill kind of the promises that Trump was making on the campaign trail of doing all the Project 2025 aligned stuff that they know is very, very unpopular, or are they going to do more popular things, which is going to be seen as a betrayal by some of their supporters, but it might be the only way to keep any semblance of popular support. But you wonder if they can't do both, right? These are two separate paths. And so it makes me wonder, how is this ever going to happen? I mean, Congress is notoriously hard to get anything through. And so maybe is that one of the main takeaways, is just like this is going to be really, really hard for them to get anything through Congress?
I think so. I mean, like you said, that Trump can choose to be popular or he can choose Project 2025. He can't do both. So that's going to be very, very difficult. Whether it pertains to our issue or not, how that gets through, I think that could be pretty challenging. Naturally, we could start seeing some of the religious freedom bills, some of the voucher bills starting to move, but we're going to be on top of that. They're not a high priority for a lot of the more moderate members who probably want to see more on the tax cut side, more on the deregulation side, rather than the far right members. So being able to cobble that together, whether and how they can assemble votes in the House, whether it can be on a budget reconciliation where they need 51. And as of today, the filibuster is still there. So a lot of the major changes that Trump will want might still require 60 votes. So those are still some pretty impressive legislative hurdles. And as mentioned a little earlier, that if you compare it to 2016, there were 241 Republicans in the House, max 225. So very, very tight majorities.
And I guess the other takeaway is, with all of these races that are so close, I think even though a lot of people are going to be feeling extremely fatigued, especially coming out of this just grueling marathon presidential election cycle, the reality is it's a very important time to get plugged in. Like not today, literally, of course, we have a little bit of a breather fortunately, before people start running for things again. But in the next cycle, there are going to be so many consequential races. And you can look, for instance, in Wisconsin, where we had split ticket situation where Tammy Baldwin retained her Senate seat, but Trump took the state. So there are obviously these places where it's tremendously contentious and can have a huge impact for who wins these tight races.
Yeah, and I think we're going to start seeing, again, just as we know what's coming up the calendar, there's the Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, where the liberal majority could flip back to more of a conservative picture as well. Then, of course, going into more school board races, plus races in New Jersey, Virginia, and Louisiana as well. So the voters are going to be able to have their piece on where they think the Trump administration is going and what they think about Project 2025 and other Republican priorities as well. So that's going to be I think that's going to be interesting. And one of the theories on the election is that it used to be the Democrats didn't really show up in midterms and that the Republicans did. And you would see that through the Republican wins in 2010, 2014. There seems to be some evidence that that position may have flipped a little bit. So you saw Democrats performing really well in 2018, 2022, especially in 2022, where the red wave just didn't really happen. So that's going to be interesting to see if Democrats, who some might see as more plugged in the off cycle in the smaller elections, could play a pretty strong role. So that's going to be a very strong trend to watch, and we'll get a big indicator of that going into the Supreme Court race in April for Wisconsin.
Yeah. Okay. And that's the next big race that people who are really plugged in can look forward to.
Yep.
Some of the other things I want to touch on are the other results. So obviously, everyone's talking about the presidential result, makes sense. But there were also a lot of ballot referendums that people were voting on various topics, and it's really interesting. And mostly, I think this was really favorable news. So FFRF was advocating strongly in favor of pro-reproductive rights ballot referendums. And we also were fighting against referendums that would have enshrined private school vouchers into state constitutions. So we were happy to see that, generally speaking, the pro-abortion, pro-reproductive rights measures did very well, and then the pro-voucher measures did not do well, which frankly I was more worried about that. You mentioned the midterms and voters showing up in the midterms. Largely, they showed up to vote in favor of reproductive rights and these sorts of measures. So it's not shocking that that was where the popular opinion was on that issue. But I was worried because there's a lot of a large lack of information behind the whole school choice topic. A lot of people still think that school choice sounds like a good thing. So I was worried that in states like Kentucky, when they said, hey, should we put private school vouchers and let parents decide how to spend their kids' public school money into the state constitution, I thought, oh no, this is going to pass. This is going to be really bad. And it didn't. Voters struck those down. So I think that really shows that people know what they're talking about, and their priorities are not as out of whack as we think on some of these issues.
Yeah,
and I think what's interesting when these voucher amendments have come up on state constitutions in the past, when it goes to actual voters, they reject them. It's kind of have that parallel with the right to an abortion. Basically, those are very favored by voters and by the public when they have a direct say. And so the theme from this election cycle seems to mirror in the past, and also what we've seen in states where you might not expect it. For instance, in Texas, a large amount of people don't want school vouchers, but some of the people in charge of state government really do want to add vouchers. So I think the theme is that the majority of people don't support this policy, despite what some in power are trying to get momentum to get those passed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would be also a little bit more for the Sunshine State. That referendum did pass with 57%. And so just the threshold in Florida is at 60. So I would give us a win on, I think that's considered a win for that one as well. And then if you also start thinking about money playing a very strong part of this, you've got Betsy DeVos writing huge checks for private school vouchers. So in some ways, it shows you that this is a very unpopular idea, even when there's a lot of money being thrown at it. And one of the biggest arguments that I saw of why people don't like it is just simply a lot of people don't live near a private school and understand that this would hurt them as well. So I think what we've been talking about, and this relates to Project 2025, that when it comes to just how the people have their say, People don't want Christian nationalism. They don't want Project 2025. They do not want a fundamentalist agenda. And if people start pursuing that, the voters are probably going to have something to say about it.
Yeah, and it highlights the need to focus on education, which is something we've been harping on over and over again on Ask an Atheist, that not only is public education very important, just having a well-educated populace, but also more specifically on all these different topics that come up. It seems the trend is the more people learn about it, the more people get it right.
Yes.
The more people agree with us once they actually learn about it. So it's misinformation or a lack of information that is often standing in our way. So focusing on educating people is a big, big part of it.
Absolutely.
All right, so the next thing I want to talk about briefly is we, of course, support having representation for secular Americans in public elected positions. So Mark, you've done a lot of work on this topic. Do you want to talk about the results of this election in terms of how it affected the number of secular elected officials? We've always been underrepresented, but how is that going to be changing?
Well, you're still, how you slice this election is you're not going to be at parity at 21% of all elected officials are going to be from the non-faith-based community. But you are starting to see that this start moving up and up and up. So I think you're going to see hopefully we can break the 100 out secular elected officials that are coming in. But we're starting to see in more and more areas of the country that this is just not really a big deal. Even you saw in Susan Wild's race, who, again, is Jewish but is a member of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. She unfortunately did lose her seat in Pennsylvania. But again, she's one of those folks that is what the election was decided by was less than 10,000 votes. It was closer to 5,000 votes in her election. And her affiliation with the Congressional Free Thought Caucus never came up in the scores of attack ads or things along those lines. So this is just not being being a non-believer or associated with non-believers or think non-believers have equal standing in American society is not a kiss of death by any stretch of imagination. Someone who is an out non-believer, an out humanist, you saw with Representative Huffman, his vote share keeps going up. So that's really a good sign. And I think you're starting to see more of elected officials starting to say, yeah, I'm a non-believer, and, well, let's talk about policies that matter to you and ideas that matter to you.
Yeah, and I think we see the same trend at the state and local level where, you always want to start at the bottom and bring things up. You don't want to start at the very top, but we saw a lot of officials who were running for state and local positions who did not make any secret of their being non-religious. And there were very few cases where their opponents even tried to make that a big issue. There were a couple, but it's clearly, like you said, it's not the kiss of death that it used to be, where it's like, if it came out that you were an atheist, forget running for public office. That is fortunately just not the reality that we live in anymore.
Yep.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some substantive things. I know a lot of people watching probably want to know what exactly are we expecting to have happen with the incoming administration. We've been talking on this show a lot about Project 2025 and the America First Policy Institute. And so let's talk about some of the different areas that we are going to be able to stand up for state-church separation with an incoming administration that we frankly expect to be very hostile to that principle. Pat, do you maybe want to kick us off, talk about either Project 2025 or maybe judicial nominations, which has always been on the top of our list?
Yeah, and I think not to sugarcoat it, because we've been, I think, talking very positively about some of the things that FFRF can do and what we're going to be doing and fighting. The bad news is that Trump is going to appoint more judges who have lifetime appointments. And that was to the scores of hundreds in his last administration. A thing that FFRF can do is informing senators about the qualifications of those judges. We know in the past, I think FFRF was instrumental in stopping at least one or more judges in the last administration because of their Christian nationalist advocacy that they've done in the past. I think it's going to be very important for us to continue to monitor who's being appointed and informing the senators who are vetting those nominees of what's problematic about those judges. And so it's not just the judges. Obviously, there's other appointments that we'll be working on. But for our legal work, it's certainly very important to make sure that we have qualified judges who have lifetime appointments and that we're weighing in, at least expressing, what our membership cares about is, are these judges going to be fair and impartial on issues that we care about? That's certainly something we can do.
Yeah, and there's also the immediacy of, what do we do before the next administration comes in? And a lot of the priority right now, I think, needs to be filling every judicial vacancy that we can. The FFRF put out in 2020 a report on Trump judges after his first term. And it was, if you didn't catch it at the time, I think it's worth going back and revisiting it. It is I think a pretty stark wake-up call for people who weren't following it closely about the degree to which his administration was able to take over the federal judiciary. People know about the Supreme Court appointments, but even at the lower levels, there were so many vacancies, and they just crammed judges through at an incredible pace. So I think we can expect that they would love to continue that pace, of course.
Yeah, and for right now, we're working very closely with our allies at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. Think of them as kind of the trade association for a lot of civil, human rights and justice based organizations. So us, reproductive organizations, LGBTQ, environment, labor, a lot of really good folks. And so for the next few weeks, it's working with allies on Capitol Hill, the administration, and just making sure that the rallying cry is leave no judges behind. So you're going to start seeing more judges starting to go through to make sure that they are in both by the time the Senate turns over, and we're ready to go with that as well. But yes, during when Trump and the Republican Senate does come in, there are going to be some tough fights. But one of the things that I always think about is if you look at how well prepared we are today than when we were in 2016, night and day. So you've got a lot of folks on our side who are very engaged, who understand this issue, who even actually vote on this issue, not just on Supreme Court, but understand of how the lower courts really start shaping policies, start getting things moving towards the Supreme Court, and why these are really, really important. And again, these are pretty tough concepts, and I'm really proud that a lot of our members are taking the time to, tune shows like this and really figure and help us in our advocacy to move forward so we can push back on some of those folks as well. So people really rallied with Kavanaugh. You saw that. You saw a lot of the lower courts, and people who are really egregious. Some of them had the brakes put on them. So you're going to see a fair amount of activity. You're going to see a fair amount of activity from us on it. And you're probably going to hear a lot about some pretty questionable folks who could get jobs for life on the courts.
Yeah, and for our members and followers, we will be there to be informing you about who these people are and doing as much vetting as we can. Those of you who've been members for a while will remember that we were really on top of that in the first administration. And when names came up, there were a lot of times when the media was kind of saying, we've never heard of this person, what's going on? And we were there kind of sounding the alarm saying, we've been dealing with this person for a while, we know all about them, here's the background information on them. So you can unfortunately maybe, with some of these folks, you can look forward to that and follow all the stuff that we put out to stay informed.
Great.
All right. Another topic, maybe something that's less known, involves some of these sort of obscure federal agencies and ideas. Does one of you want to take what are we talking about with agencies like the OMB or OIRA? And then on a related point, what is the term impoundment? What does that mean?
All right. So a lot of what you talked about is a big part of what holds up Project 2025. And Project 2025 a lot of it is using administrative resources to centralize power within the executive branch and with the presidency. So that means grabbing more power. on that. So the Office of Management Budget and OIRA, it's just often referred to as OIRA, but it's the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. These organizations, what are these government entities? They're kind of the central clearinghouse and the thing that moves forward a lot of regulations and makes sure that a lot of regulations follow the law. Think of regulations as the how a law is interpreted. So Congress passes a law, signed into law by the presidency, but the nitty-gritty of how a law is implemented, that's a regulation. And when a government wants to, or an executive branch wants to make changes to a regulation or how something's implemented, it most cases needs to go through the Office of Management and Budget and OIRA. So if you've got a real strong Trump loyalist in those positions, they could start doing things like squeezing down comment times, fast tracking things, really moving things forward and having a very strong political agenda, all with the mind to start centralizing power in the executive branch and giving Trump himself a lot of power. So they're not well-known entities, so we know we're going to be on top of Secretary of Education, the Attorney General, but these lesser-known entities we're going to be just on top of as well on that. And Pat, anything on the administrative law side?
Yeah, we can, and we have in the past sued before the Trump administration. And under the Administrative Procedures Act, these government agencies do have to follow a particular policy, and that can actually slow things down or make it, make sure that policies are sound and properly vetted. We have done that before with other groups in a coalition suing the Trump administration. Here, some of the policies that Trump has already talked about are certainly things where they'd have to go through the normal administrative process where they give notice to the public. We provide comments. The government has to respond to those comments. And it can't adopt policies that are arbitrary or capricious. And so our organization and others certainly can challenge policies that don't follow that process. So I do expect that's something that FFRF and other orgs will be able to do against the Trump administration, despite it being, not a constitutional vehicle to do challenges. There are things that impact our members, impact civil rights that we can be involved in challenging.
And Ryan, to get back to your point about impoundment. So impoundment right now is, well, about 2 years ago, it was this very fringe, very conservative legal theory that basically says that the president can not spend money that Congress authorizes. So when we say the appropriations process, and as our lawyers, let me know if I'm off on this one, that Congress appropriates money to be spent in a certain way, signed into law by the president. It's in the Constitution. You have to do this. But there's some very conservative legal theorists that say, no. The president can make decisions on where money can go, even if it's been appropriate or if he thinks it's being spent wrong. It's a little tenuous right now, but if you have a very friendly Supreme Court, you might authorize it. If you have a very, very friendly OMB and OIRA, as we talked about, this is one of the things that they might start allowing and could aid the Trump administration to start doing and let the courts catch up. So the idea of impoundment is very serious. We hope it doesn't go through, but that's one of the big Project 2025 pillars that it stands on. And again, it's not really well known, but it could become very destructive very quickly, and we're absolutely going to be watching it with ourselves and also with a lot of our good governance partners.
Yeah, that's right. And this goes back to the Nixon era of executive overreach, where they were doing this impoundment stuff where, Congress would say, we always say that, like you said, Congress controls the purse strings. So in theory, Congress has control of what happens to federal funds. But the Nixon administration was just like, well, I'm not so sure about that because, we actually have literal control of dispersing these funds and whatnot. So how about I just don't do what you told me to do? And the worry is that this is the sort of in-the-weeds, obscure legal topic that I guarantee Donald Trump does not just read up on this stuff and find on his own. So when you hear him mentioning this sort of stuff when he's out and about, someone is whispering in his ear to say, hey, this is something you should be planting the seeds of. So it is very concerning. And as Mark said, we will be there with our allies to be watching it very closely and reporting it to our members. All right. Now on something that is probably not news to anyone who follows FFRF. So Pat, do you want to talk a little bit about the Comstock Act and how it relates to Project 2025, what we expect the incoming administration to do related to that?
Yeah, and I'm not the complete expert on this, but the short issue is will the incoming administration, the Trump administration, use this Comstock Act to ban things like access to mifepristone, an abortion pill, access to contraceptives. Apparently, there have been a number of people who've been rumored to be on the high up list for the Attorney General position have expressed interest in using the Comstock Act in this way. So basically, federally, restricting access to reproductive health care. So it's a huge concern, I think, nationally. And as we heard when the whole Dobbs argument was going before the Supreme Court, some of these issues were supposed to be left to the states, and now, of course, exactly what we were concerned about is you have a federal government, people who are very religious and very Christian, wanting to control other people's decisions, important decisions about whether they have children or how many children they have. So I think there's extreme concern that could be abused and used, and obviously would lead to litigation, but we don't know how the courts ultimately are going to handle that. There's very good case law going back to the early 1900s on this, but we don't know what the current courts would do with it.
Yeah.
Right. And with the Comstock Act itself, we know it's this old law from the 1870s. It was put in by a fundamentalist, and even he was. And Ryan, we were talking a little bit about this during the break. That this guy, where people about the amount of hardship this law said, where you can't mail anything related to an abortion or aid an abortion, people committed suicide on. And he was pretty happy. So that's kind of what we're dealing with on this one. With Comstock itself, again, this is the push and pull between what Johnson's going to have to deal with his frontline members, less than 10,000 votes, and then the hardcore folks. So if this goes into place, if yes, right now we have a memo from the Biden administration says we're not enforcing Comstock, but Trump could upend that. If that happens, I think you're going to see a lot of those members who even said, look, it should relate, abortion should rest to the state. Trump has said something very similar to that. I don't really trust him, but that could become a very contentious issue very, very quickly. And plus, moreover, it's just really friggin' cruel and awful. And we had a conversation about this earlier today. Stopping the Comstock Act is one of our big legislative priorities, and just how inhumane this would be. It would be just terrible of not allowing people to access abortion access, abortion pills, mifepristone, and just it would be catastrophic just in terms of human terms. So I hope I hope that argument wins out. I hope the political argument wins out. But I know that this is one of our absolute top legislative priorities, whether it comes into place and also with Congress as well.
Yeah, and for people who are interested in more on that, by the way, we had an episode of our show Free Thought Matters with Amy So, who's an expert in Comstock, and really did a deep dive into what's going on there.
Yeah, the other topic, which I think we've talked about Project 2025, but also Trump talked about last year, what he wants to do with education and public education. I think it's a serious concern and risk to the country, and we actually have a video clip of that.
Rather than indoctrinating young people with inappropriate racial, sexual, and political material, which is what we're doing now, our schools must be totally refocused to prepare our children to succeed in the world of work and in life and the world of keeping our country strong. Here are 10 key ideas that will power our movement for great schools. Fifth, we will support bringing back prayer to our schools. Seventh, we will give all parents the right to choose another school for their children if they want. It's called school choice. And one other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it. You can't do worse.
Yeah, so this is one of the main legal issues we work on at FFRF is making sure that our public schools remain secular, that our public money stays in public schools and doesn't fund religious schools. And I noticed, and I don't know if you both weigh in on this, but even in his remarks, it's contradictory. The idea that the government's going to mandate certain things, and then at the end saying, by the way, we're just going to destroy the Department of Education and have states do all of this. So I don't think we're getting a cohesive message. We'll have to see what happens in this administration, but they've been talking a lot about destroying the Department of Education. On the other hand, they want to implement kind of religious ideology within schools and mandate nationwide vouchers is what it sounds like. So I think those two things are contradictory, and I don't know if you have a take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think also what we saw on the school board level is that Moms for Liberty had to pivot a fair amount this election cycle and had to roll back some of what they were promoting a little while ago, because a lot of folks were like, wow, you're pretty far out there, and this is pretty bad for our kids. So that's going to be running into that. That notion is going to be into running into that reality. Other organizations that are doing great work, like Our Schools USA, which promote sane school boards. A lot of their ideas are make school boards boring again, of going up against a lot of these fundamentalist ideas. And quite frankly, again, what we saw with Project 2025, a lot of them are very, very unpopular. So this is, again, does Trump want to be popular, or does he want Project 2025? And it looks like for this one, he's going into a Project 2025 direction. And I don't think that's where he really wants to be. And just a lot of these ideas just don't make sense. As Pat said, they're contradictory, and people on the whole don't want them. And I think you took from the ballot initiatives and ballot referendums, the American people couldn't be more clear. In Colorado and in places like Kentucky, the American people are abundantly clear of where they stand on this issue.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is going to be very deeply unpopular if he sticks to those talking points. Okay, so we're going to pick up the pace just a little bit because we want to make sure we leave some time for audience questions. But Pat, as our legal director, can you speak a little bit? We have a history of suing the Trump administration, and if we have need to, we certainly will be ready to do so again. Do you want to talk a little bit about when we've gone to the legal battlefield with them in the past?
Yeah, and I made reference to one type of challenge that we've participated in the past is this Administrative Procedures Act challenge. When Trump was leaving office, he wanted to basically roll back civil rights at various, I think there was 8 different departments within his administration. We sued with a coalition of groups. Again, I think these were finalized in January as he's leaving office. Even after January 6th, it became final rules. We sued. Thankfully, with the Biden administration coming in, they were able to go through the same process to repeal those rules. So ultimately, our lawsuit didn't need to get a final court decision, but we are able to challenge these types of things that Trump may do in the next term. We also sued Trump over records because his office was doing a number of religious things, including Ben Carson at Housing and Urban Development, his White House Bible study. They were restricting our access to shine sunlight on what the government's doing. That's another tool in our toolkit to be using the Freedom of Information Act to find out, is our government, abiding by the Constitution. We were able to sue and also successfully resolve that lawsuit under the prior administration. So I think it's something for our members and for the public to keep in mind that we do have legal challenges are an option and almost a certainty with the next administration.
And Mark was talking earlier about regulations and rules and how laws actually get implemented. And one important thing to remember for people who are familiar with that administrative law world is that the Supreme Court removed recently a standard that's known as Chevron deference. So this is really into like legal nerd land, but it's actually really important. What it means is that it's easier than ever to challenge regulations. So if you have a hostile administration, that's actually good news, that whatever the Trump administration agencies put out, those rules are going to be held to a higher standard than they previously would have been in the past courts would have had to give deference to them, and that's no longer the case. So we will absolutely be there ready to challenge those rules as they come out.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's weird how things can work in both ways on that. I mean, with this court, everything is a jump ball. And then one of the things that I think would be something also to make sure we keep our eye on is that pretty soon after Trump comes into office, he's going to issue something akin to a religious freedom executive order. And he already did this in his first term, so we know he's going to do it again. But this one, aided by really favorable court decisions, again, going back to the courts, whether it's Fulton or 303 Creative or the Dobbs decision, it's going to be akin to giving agencies, individuals, entities, something akin to, you want a religious exemption or a religious reason to discriminate against somebody, go for it. And this administration might have your back. That would be my primary concern. Obviously, especially we can think about how this could have a terrible impact in a lot of areas of American life, especially healthcare. So that's something we're going to be on the watch for. But again, as that gets implemented through regulations, through regulations or whatnot, as you said earlier, we might have some more recourses that we didn't have a little while ago.
Okay, and one last topic I want to cover before we switch to audience questions, which is both of your takes generally on to what extent do you think Trump will be successful? That's a question on a lot of people's minds. I'd love to hear what both of you think. And then also, right now, the media is all about who his appointments are. So any comments on who he has appointed or who you think he may appoint?
In terms of success, I think we live in a way where we can't predict at this moment in time. If he's going to do the power grab draconian theocracy, that will be extremely unpopular, and I think there will be huge pushback on that. If he does it more incrementally and maybe slowly boiling us, that could be a problem. But that would be much more successful in terms of, did his presidency accomplish the things it wants? So I remain kind of guarded, but I think we'll just have to see how this, especially the first month or two, start off.
Yeah, I think that's a good indicator. We know we don't have the Attorney General out yet. We don't have the Secretary of Education out yet. I imagine they're going to be coming very, very soon on that as well. But I think, again, within 6 months in Wisconsin, people are going to be able to respond to where they think this thing is going. A little bit more a year from now, 3 pretty critical states are going to be able to weigh in. And then in under 24 short months, the entire country will weigh in again. So this is not the final word on anything by any stretch of the imagination as well. And as we saw, and I think we even expressed a little bit of surprise, people are understanding a little bit more how state church can impact their lives, as we saw with the Ballot initiative on school vouchers. So that's something to start thinking about as well. But I wouldn't say he's going to get everything, and I would not count our side out of the game by a very, very, very long shot.
Absolutely, and there are going to be a lot of appointments coming up. So for instance, Lee Zeldin was appointed to be EPA secretary. Mm-hmm. He has a connection with the person who wrote the EPA section of Project 2025. So it seems like that is consistent with Trump choosing that path so far. But we will absolutely be on top of those nominations as they come out. So with that, we have a bunch of audience questions I want to get to. So let's try to respond to these relatively succinctly so that we can get to as many as possible. First question, will FFRF work to cultivate its members to run for local offices in the future? Mark, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
I think that is a really, really, really good idea in terms of that. Some of that might tip a little bit into C4 world. So definitely look for an episode of The Secular Advocate, which is coming out of FFRF's out of the Action Fund as well. We can say that. But yes, and whether it is with encouraging people to run, always a great idea. Plus, there's a lot of really good support out there with the LGBTQ Victory Institute, Emily's List, Run for Something. There's a lot of resources out there. So if folks want to get involved, there's a lot more support than there was just a few years ago.
Perfect. And Mark, another good question for you. How likely do you think it is the Senate will end the filibuster?
I don't know. I mean, if the Republicans do it, we'll see. We'll see what the new leadership does. I would weigh if I had to bet, I would weigh against it right now for the Republican leadership doing it. But again, I don't think the Senate's going to be the big problem. I think they're going to have a lot more problems in the House. So I think if the Senate can just say, okay, well, we passed this, but it was the House that screwed everything up for Trump, they're probably going to want to shift blame to Mike Johnson and the folks in the other chamber.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then another question that we can only give kind of a partial answer to because we're in 501c3 land. We can't be advocating for any candidates or parties. But Mark, another good question for you asks, can people focus on state elections in 2025, which you've mentioned to a little bit already, to help improve this situation and to help fight against Trump 2.0?
You better believe it. So absolutely, you can do that. By all means, please get involved. Whether it's through an organization, your local party structure, whatever that is, please get involved. We need your ideas, we need your voices, and quite frankly, could use a few dollars as well as there. So if you do have, I know Kamala Harris and everyone got all sorts of messages on their phone about every 3 minutes. Luckily, those have stopped, but if people can think about joining FFRF, we would certainly appreciate it, or any of our really good allied organizations as well. Quite frankly, your money goes further now early than it does later in the cycle. And we're starting to see in a lot of races, whether they're for Congress, state legislature, you're not running just a few months before the election. These are multi-year propositions. So a lot of people who are thinking about 2026 should start thinking about what those campaigns could look like, how they can amass resources, support, because 2026 is going to be here a lot faster than people think.
Absolutely. All right, legal question for you, Pat. Can we be more purposeful in attacking government subsidies and tax exemptions for religious nonprofits? So what more can we do about faith-based government funding?
Yeah, one thing, and I mean, can go into a few different ways, but one thing that FFRF has been, I think, a leader on is the Johnson Amendment, which the whole idea is that nonprofits and churches aren't spending, tax-free, basically money that nobody paid tax on towards political campaigns. That's something we've been a leader on. We continually, message to people in Congress about the importance of the Johnson Amendment, message to the IRS about the importance. The other role is states have a role in this too. States regulate nonprofits. And so I think that's something that FFRF is going to be looking closer at because the IRS, frankly, hasn't been great at enforcing the Johnson Amendment. States, which regulate nonprofits, have a lot more potential to start to do so because I think this last election cycle was pretty terrible with how many, regardless of party, churches were more involved than they should be in elections. And that's not something that's legally permitted. I think it's something we need to to take a closer look at.
Yeah, and with the developments of, the federal judiciary going in probably a relatively bad direction, the other option is with state funding. There are a lot of states that give tons of taxpayer money to religious entities, and we've challenged that in the past successfully. And state constitutions sometimes have higher bars than the federal constitution against this sort of activity. So that's another area that we can, as a movement, we can definitely be focusing on is like in this particular state, in state court, can we challenge these faith-based subsidies? All right, one more question. And so, Mark, I think this one probably should go to you as well. What efforts are there to develop a critical mass of atheists, non-religious, naturalists, agnostics, so nuns generally? What efforts are there to develop a critical mass of nuns to garner actual political power?
Keep doing what you're doing, keep voting, keep participating, keep it all up, and bring your friends is the best way to do it. If you want to go a little further, absolutely run for something is the big takeaway. But I think a lot of the message that is definitely starting to get through, or at least I hope for folks who are thinking a little more like us, is that this is not you do something once every 4 years and then take a break. This is every school board election, every midterm election, every state election. showing up, participating, making your voice heard, whether it is at town council meetings or different ideas, that we've certainly seen a higher level of engagement on and starting to see a lot more solidification around that. So keep up the good work. I know folks are probably pretty tired right now, but when you're ready, jump on back in because we definitely need you. And it's going to be a pretty critical 24 months.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for your insights and for your little dose of optimism, which I certainly needed a little bit. That will wrap up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show Free Thought Matters airs this weekend. FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will speak with British Iranian human rights activist Maryam Namazi about the silencing and erasure of women by Islamist theocracies.
Very often people will be persecuted for not necessarily even their political beliefs or, let's say, their atheism or their apostasy, but the very fact of who they are. For example, being a woman, I think, under theocracies, Islamic theocracies, is the same as being a criminal, really. It's criminalized. So a lot of things that we take for granted, like wearing what we want to wear, listening to the music we want to, loving who we want, studying what we want, traveling wherever we want. All of these are restricted and denied to women.
You'll be able to watch that episode soon on the FFRF YouTube channel. And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, you'll hear religious scholar Dr. Bradley Onishi talk about Christian nationalism's threat to democracy. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you so much. If not, please join us. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.